Someone should really put that thing out of its misery. The comment carried easily across the marble foyer, sharp enough to cut through the string quartet, loud enough that Delilah Marsh froze halfway up the grand staircase, a tray of empty champagne flutes trembling slightly in her hands. She knew, without turning around, exactly who had said it and exactly who they meant. What none of the 200 guests gathered for the Castiglione anniversary gala expected was for the family's most feared son, a man who had never once raised his voice at an employee in 15 years of running an empire built on silence and fear, to cross the entire foyer, lift the humiliated housekeeper directly into his arms in front of everyone, and carry her out of that ballroom like she weighed nothing at all. Nobody in that room understood why. Not yet. What none of them knew was that 30 seconds earlier, Delilah's ankle had given out beneath her on a staircase someone had deliberately left unlit, and the man carrying her out wasn't performing chivalry for an audience. He was making absolutely certain nobody in that house ever got the chance to hurt her like that again. Delilah Marsh had worked in the Castiglione household for 4 years, long enough to know every creaking floorboard, every guest who tipped generously and every guest who complained about imaginary dust simply because complaining made them feel important. She was 29, plus size, and had long since stopped expecting the family she worked for to remember her name, let alone treat her like a person instead of a uniform that happened to move through their hallways. She didn't mind, mostly. Or she had trained herself to believe she didn't. The way people do when the alternative is carrying resentment around every single day like a stone in their shoe. She had a younger brother finishing college on the tuition her paycheck quietly covered, a mother recovering from a stroke 2 years earlier who needed a caregiver 3 afternoons a week, and a landlord who raised the rent every January like clockwork. She didn't have room in her life for pride. She had room for showing up, doing the work well, and going home. The Castiglione estate was, by any measure, one of the more demanding houses to work in the city's private staffing circuit. Not because the family was cruel, exactly, but because the household ran on a rhythm of constant, glittering performance, galas, dinners, business functions disguised as social occasions, each one requiring the same invisible precision from the staff who made them possible. Vittorio Castiglione ran that rhythm the way his father had before him, with a calm, watchful authority that unsettled people more than shouting ever could. At 39, he had inherited not just a shipping empire with legitimate paperwork and considerably less legitimate side operations, but also a reputation that made grown men choose their words carefully in his presence. He rarely smiled in public. He rarely needed to. He also, over 4 years, had come to notice Delilah in a way he suspected she had no idea he noticed anyone at all. It wasn't romantic, not at first, not in any way he could have named clearly even to himself. It was smaller than that. The way she remembered, without being told twice, that his Aunt Rosalind took her tea with honey instead of sugar. The way she never once complained when events ran late into the night, but always made sure the youngest staff members got sent home first, covering their remaining duties herself without announcing it. The way she moved through his house like someone determined to be useful and invisible in equal measure, as though visibility itself was a luxury she'd decided long ago she couldn't afford. He had never spoken to her about any of it. That would have required an explanation he wasn't yet ready to give, even to himself. The anniversary gala, 30 years since his parents' wedding, had been in planning for months, and every detail carried the particular weight of a Castiglione event, meaning every detail mattered to someone whose displeasure came with consequences. The household staff had been preparing for a week straight, and by the night of the gala itself, exhaustion sat heavy behind every polished smile in the building, Delilah's included. She had been assigned the east staircase, the ornate one connecting the main ballroom to the upper gallery where guests could view the family's private art collection, carrying trays up and down all evening in heels that had stopped feeling like a reasonable choice 3 hours earlier. She didn't know, climbing that staircase for perhaps the 20th time that night, that someone had deliberately loosened the small decorative runner rug pinned along the 3rd step from the top, nor that the sconce lighting along that particular section had been switched off 20 minutes earlier under the pretense of a bulb replacement that never actually happened. She only knew, in the space of about half a second, that her foot caught on something that shouldn't have been there, that the tray of empty champagne flutes went flying from her hands in a bright, shattering arc, and that she was falling, hard, toward a marble staircase in front of 200 of the city's wealthiest guests. The crash of breaking glass cut through the string quartet's performance like a gunshot. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. And in the sudden, mortifying silence that followed, before anyone even registered whether she was hurt, a voice near the base of the staircase, clear, amused, entirely too pleased with itself, cut across the foyer. Someone should really put that thing out of its misery. The words came from Cressida Van Hollen, daughter of a real estate developer with old money and older grudges, a woman who had spent the better part of the evening making pointed comments about the quality of household staff these days loud enough for exactly the right people to hear. She said it laughing, glancing sideways at the small cluster of guests near her as though inviting them to share the joke, as though the woman crumpled on the staircase above them, ankle already swelling beneath her stocking, existed primarily as an opportunity for entertainment. A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. Enough that the sound of it reached Delilah exactly as clearly as the pain radiating up from her ankle, and something in her chest went hollow and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the fall itself. She had been mocked before. Working in wealthy homes for a decade had taught her that some guests treated cruelty toward staff as a kind of sport, low stakes, low consequence, a way of asserting status that cost them nothing. She had learned to absorb it, to keep her face composed, to finish her shift and cry about it later if she needed to, privately, where it wouldn't cost her the job her family depended on. She was already reaching for the shattered glass around her, already trying to arrange her face into the careful, apologetic neutrality expected of staff who caused a scene, no matter how involuntarily, when a second sound cut through the foyer, quieter than Cressida's laugh but somehow carrying twice the weight. Say that again. The room went from murmuring to absolutely silent in the space of 2 words. Vittorio Castiglione stood near the base of the staircase, having crossed the foyer from the far side of the ballroom faster than anyone present would have believed a man his size capable of moving, his expression carrying none of the practiced, watchful calm his guests were accustomed to. Cressida's laugh died in her throat. "I said," he repeated, his voice low, controlled, and somehow far more frightening for its lack of volume. "Say that again." "Vittorio, I only meant." "I heard exactly what you meant." He didn't wait for her to finish. He was already moving past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time, kneeling beside Delilah on the landing where broken glass caught the chandelier light like scattered ice. "Don't move. Where does it hurt?" Delilah, mortified, humiliated, in genuine pain, and now utterly unable to process the fact that Vittorio Castiglione was kneeling beside her in front of the entire party, managed a shaky breath. "My ankle. I think I twisted it. I'm so sorry, sir, I'll clean this up right away." "You will do no such thing." He was already assessing her ankle with careful, precise hands, the same hands 200 guests had watched sign business deals worth more than most of their houses, checking for the telltale swelling of a break rather than a sprain. "You're not cleaning anything up tonight. Someone needs to. Someone will." His jaw was tight, his eyes flicking briefly, coldly, toward Cressida Van Hollen, who stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her earlier amusement entirely gone, replaced by something considerably closer to fear. "Not you." Without another word, without asking permission, without any of the careful, staff-employer boundaries that had governed every interaction between them for 4 years, Vittorio lifted Delilah directly into his arms. The gasp that rippled through the assembled guests was audible even over the string quartet, which had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, stopped playing entirely, the musicians apparently as stunned as everyone else by the scene unfolding on the staircase. "Put me down," Delilah whispered, her face burning, acutely aware of every single eye in the ballroom now fixed on the 2 of them. "Please, everyone's watching, I can walk if I just." "You can't," Vittorio said quietly, already carrying her down the remaining stairs with the same steady, unhurried authority he brought to everything he did. "And I don't particularly care who's watching." He carried her the full length of the ballroom, past 200 guests who had gathered to celebrate 30 years of Castiglione marriage and were now witnessing something considerably more unexpected, past his own mother, whose carefully composed expression flickered briefly with something unreadable, past his father, who watched with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what he was seeing even if the rest of the room didn't yet. He carried her out through the side doors into the cool night air, away from the chandeliers and the whispers and the shattered glass still glittering on the marble staircase behind them, and didn't set her down until they reached the private study on the ground floor, settling her carefully onto the leather sofa near the fireplace, propping her injured ankle with the same precise care he'd shown examining it moments earlier. "I'm calling Dr. Reyes," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Vittorio, it's your parents' anniversary. You can't just leave your own gala. Watch me." He made the call standing near the window, his voice low and clipped, arranging for the family physician to arrive within the hour. Delilah sat on the sofa, humiliation and pain and something else entirely, something warmer and more confused, tangling together in her chest as she watched him, still in his formal suit, still visibly furious in the tightly controlled way that made his guests speak carefully around him even on his calmest days. "You didn't have to do any of that," she said quietly, once he'd ended the call. "I'm aware of what I had to do and what I chose to do," Vittorio said, turning to face her fully for the first time since carrying her out of the ballroom. "This wasn't obligation, Delilah." It was the first time, in 4 years, that he had used her first name. "That woman," Delilah said carefully. "The one who made the comment. I don't think it was an accident. The staircase. The runner rug has never been loose before, and someone turned off the sconces earlier tonight. I noticed it when I was carrying trays up. I thought maybe it was just an oversight." Something in Vittorio's expression went very still. "You think this was deliberate?" "I don't know. I might be wrong." She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "I don't want to accuse anyone of something I can't prove." "You won't have to." His voice carried a quiet, dangerous certainty that made her look up. "I'll find out myself." What Delilah didn't know, standing on the edge of an accusation she hadn't quite made, was that Vittorio Castiglione had spent the last 2 weeks quietly investigating financial irregularities within his own household staff that had, until this exact moment, seemed entirely unconnected to a housekeeper he'd been slowly, cautiously, allowing himself to care about. He was about to discover that they were not unconnected at all. 3 weeks earlier, Vittorio's head of household security, a methodical, unflappable man named Dario Conti, had brought him a discrepancy in the estate's staffing budget too small to trigger automatic alerts but too consistent to be coincidence. A part-time position, listed on payroll as additional event coordination, drawing a modest but regular salary for the better part of 8 months, attached to no actual employee anyone on staff could identify. "It's not much money," Dario had explained, spreading the relevant documents across Vittorio's desk. "Small enough that it wouldn't raise flags in a normal audit. But someone's been collecting a paycheck under a position that doesn't exist, and whoever approved the original hiring paperwork used your mother's signature stamp without her knowledge." Vittorio had frowned at the documents. "Who has access to that stamp?" "Household administration." Which narrows it down considerably, but not completely. Dario hesitated. "There's something else. The payments route, eventually, through a private account connected to Cressida Van Hollen's household staffing agency." The name had meant little to Vittorio at the time, one of dozens of families whose social orbit intersected periodically with his own, the Van Hollens known primarily for real estate holdings and a daughter with an expensive education and an expensive sense of entitlement to match. He had asked Dario to continue investigating quietly, assuming, at the time, that he was looking at a minor case of staffing fraud, someone skimming small amounts through a fabricated position, nothing that would ultimately connect to anything more serious than a wasted afternoon of paperwork review. He had not anticipated that the investigation would eventually intersect with an attempt to physically harm someone in his own household. The truth, which emerged over the following days with the same careful, methodical precision Dario brought to everything, was considerably darker than simple fraud. Cressida Van Hollen's staffing agency, it turned out, had been quietly providing supplemental household staff for select events across several wealthy families, including 2 prior Castiglione functions earlier that year, contractors who moved through households temporarily and left no lasting trail. One of those contractors, a woman named Priscilla Doyle who had worked briefly in the Castiglione kitchen during a spring fundraiser, had been the one collecting the fabricated event coordination salary for the past 8 months, funneled quietly back to Cressida's own accounts through an arrangement that looked, on paper, like a legitimate staffing partnership. What made it more than simple financial fraud was the reason behind it. Cressida Van Hollen, Dario's investigation revealed, had spent the better part of the last year attempting, unsuccessfully, to secure Vittorio's attention through the ordinary channels available to a woman of her social standing: invitations to events, mutual acquaintances arranging introductions, careful positioning at every gala where their families' paths might cross. She had, according to several sources Dario interviewed discreetly, become increasingly convinced that Vittorio's growing attentiveness toward his own household staff, specifically toward Delilah, represented an obstacle worth removing by whatever means necessary. The fabricated staffing position wasn't fraud for its own sake. It was cover, a way of placing Priscilla Doyle inside the Castiglione household periodically without raising questions, someone positioned to quietly create small problems, misplaced items, minor scheduling errors, anything that might reflect poorly on the household staff Cressida clearly viewed as competition for attention she believed should have been hers. The loosened staircase runner and the disabled sconce lighting, it would later be confirmed, were not the accidental oversights they appeared to be. They were the most serious escalation yet in a pattern that had been building, quietly, for months. She could have killed her, Dario said grimly, laying out the final pieces of evidence on Vittorio's desk 2 days after the gala. While Delilah rested upstairs with her ankle, confirmed sprained rather than broken, elevated and iced under Dr. Reyes's careful instructions. A fall like that, on marble, from that height. It's not guaranteed to be fatal, but it's far from guaranteed not to be. Vittorio's expression, reading through the documentation, was colder and more controlled than Dario had seen it in years. Cressida did this because of Delilah. It looks that way. Every previous incident traces back to weeks when your attention toward Miss Marsh was, by the reports I've gathered, becoming more noticeable to people paying attention. Dario paused carefully, including, apparently, Miss Van Hollen. Vittorio sat back slowly, processing the full weight of what he was looking at. 200 guests at his parents' anniversary gala had watched a woman he cared about, more deeply than he'd allowed himself to admit even to himself until the moment he'd knelt beside her on that staircase, nearly seriously injured because another woman's jealousy had curdled into something dangerous enough to sabotage a physical structure inside his own home. "I want everything documented," he said finally. "Every transfer, every fabricated position, every connection back to Cressida personally, not just her agency. I want it airtight before I confront her with any of it." And the staircase? That's not fraud anymore, Dario. That's attempted assault. Vittorio's voice had gone very quiet, very still, the tone his enemies had learned, over the years, to fear considerably more than shouting. "I want proof of that specifically, and I want it soon." It took 11 days. 11 days during which Delilah, confined largely to a guest suite on the estate's ground floor at Vittorio's insistence, despite her repeated, increasingly exasperated protests that she was perfectly capable of managing a sprained ankle in her own small apartment, found herself in the strange, disorienting position of being cared for by the same household she had spent 4 years quietly serving. "This is ridiculous," she told him, on the 3rd day, when he appeared in the doorway of the guest suite carrying a tray of soup he had, according to the kitchen staff, insisted on preparing himself, badly, with considerably more determination than skill. "I'm a housekeeper, Vittorio. I don't belong in a guest suite being waited on." "You belong exactly where I decide is best for your recovery," Vittorio said. setting the tray down with the careful precision of a man entirely unaccustomed to domestic tasks. "And right now, that's here. Your staff is going to talk. My staff has been talking about considerably more interesting things than a sprained ankle since the moment I carried you out of that ballroom." He pulled up a chair beside the bed, sitting with none of the formal distance that had governed 4 years of employer-employee interaction between them. "Let them talk." Delilah studied him carefully, the soup cooling slightly between them, the fire crackling in the small hearth across the room. "You still haven't told me what you found. About the staircase." Vittorio's expression sobered. "I have. I wasn't ready to tell you until I was certain." "Certain of what?" "That the fall wasn't an accident." He watched her face carefully as he said it, gauging exactly how much of the truth she was prepared to hear in one sitting. "Someone loosened the runner and disabled the lighting deliberately, the night of the gala. We have documentation now connecting it directly to Cressida Van Hollen." Delilah went very still. "She tried to hurt me." "She tried to hurt you," Vittorio confirmed, his voice carrying the same tightly controlled fury it had held on the staircase 11 days earlier, "because she'd convinced herself you were an obstacle standing between her and something she'd decided she wanted." "Me?" Delilah stared at him, genuinely bewildered. "I'm a housekeeper. What could I possibly be an obstacle to?" Vittorio was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its controlled precision, replaced by something rawer, more uncertain than she had ever heard from him in 4 years of working in his home. "Me," he said simply. "She wanted my attention, and over the last several months, my attention has been, increasingly, somewhere else entirely." Delilah's breath caught. "Vittorio. I should have said something a long time before someone got hurt trying to eliminate the reason for it," he said, cutting off whatever protest she'd been about to voice. "I've spent 4 years telling myself it wasn't appropriate, that the difference in our positions in this house made it complicated, that you probably didn't think of me as anything other than your employer. I told myself all of that right up until the moment I watched you fall down that staircase and realized I'd rather burn down every carefully maintained boundary I've built in this house than risk losing the chance to tell you the truth. Everyone in that ballroom is going to have theories about what that meant. Let them have theories." Vittorio reached out, carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wanted to, and gently took her hand. "I'm considerably more interested in what you think it meant." Delilah looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him, and something in her chest, some careful, protective wall she had built over years of being overlooked, underestimated, and occasionally mocked by exactly the kind of people who filled ballrooms like his, finally, quietly, began to come down. "I think," she said carefully, "that I've spent 4 years telling myself the exact same things you just described. That it wasn't appropriate. That you probably didn't think of me as anything other than staff." She managed a small, tired smile. "I think we've both been very foolish for a very long time." "I'd like to stop being foolish," Vittorio said quietly. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," Delilah said. "Though I'd like to point out that this entire conversation is happening because I have a sprained ankle and you're wearing an apron that doesn't fit you at all." Vittorio glanced down at himself, at the apron he'd apparently forgotten he was still wearing, and something in his carefully controlled expression finally, genuinely broke into a smile. "The moment isn't as romantic as I would have preferred." "It's exactly the right amount of romantic," Delilah said, and meant it. The confrontation with Cressida Van Hollen happened 4 days later, not at another glittering gala, but in the considerably less forgiving setting of Vittorio's private study, where Dario Conti had spent the better part of 2 weeks assembling documentation thorough enough to leave no room for the kind of deflection Cressida had built her entire social strategy around. She arrived expecting, according to the message Vittorio had sent through mutual acquaintances, a private conversation about renewing her family's business partnership with Castiglione shipping interests. She left, less than an hour later, understanding that her family's business partnership, along with a considerable portion of her own social standing, had just been permanently and irreparably damaged. "I don't know what you think you've found," Cressida said, seated stiffly across from Vittorio's desk, her composure fraying visibly as he laid out, methodically, the fabricated staffing position, the signature forgery, the 8 months of payments, the loosened staircase runner, the disabled lighting. "I know exactly what I've found," Vittorio said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown Delilah days earlier, all of the cold, precise authority that had made his enemies careful around him for years. "I have Priscilla Doyle's full statement, given voluntarily once she understood the difference between facing consequences for staffing fraud and facing consequences for attempted assault. She's confirmed you personally instructed her regarding the staircase, specifically, the night of my parents' anniversary." Cressida's face drained of color. "That's not. I never told her to hurt anyone. I only wanted. You only wanted my household staff to have a small, embarrassing accident in front of 200 guests, Vittorio finished for her. An accident significant enough to humiliate a specific woman, on a marble staircase, from a height that could easily have resulted in serious injury or worse. I'm considerably less interested in what you told yourself you wanted, Cressida, than in what actually happened as a result of it. Vittorio, please. Every business relationship between our families is terminated, effective immediately," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "I've already informed your father of the reasons, along with the full documentation. What he chooses to do with that information regarding his own daughter is entirely his business. What I choose to do involves ensuring you never set foot in my household again, and ensuring every family in this city's social circles understands exactly why. You'd destroy my reputation over a housekeeper." Something in Vittorio's expression went very still and very dangerous. "I'd destroy considerably more than your reputation for someone who tried to seriously injure a person in my home," he said quietly. "You should consider yourself fortunate that documentation and public exposure are the only consequences I'm currently pursuing." Cressida left the estate that afternoon in considerably less composed a state than she'd arrived, and within a week, the story, carefully, deliberately released through exactly the right channels by Vittorio himself, had spread through the city's wealthiest circles with the particular speed reserved for scandals involving families everyone already suspected of hiding something. Priscilla Doyle, facing the choice between cooperation and considerably worse consequences, provided a full statement to both Dario's investigation and, eventually, local authorities, ensuring the incident carried legal as well as social weight. The Van Hollen family's business interests, once quietly intertwined with half the city's most powerful names, found doors closing with a swiftness that suggested Vittorio Castiglione's reach extended considerably further than shipping contracts. Delilah, recovering steadily from her sprained ankle, watched the fallout from a comfortable distance, still slightly disbelieving that an entire social scandal had unfolded because someone had resented the attention a mafia boss paid his household's plus-size maid. "I still don't entirely understand it," she admitted to Vittorio, 3 weeks after the gala, sitting on the same study sofa where he'd first laid out the evidence against Cressida, her ankle nearly fully healed. She had everything. Money, family name, every advantage anyone could want. And she tried to hurt someone over jealousy. People with everything sometimes become the most dangerous when they're denied one specific thing they've decided they're entitled to, Vittorio said, settling beside her with 2 cups of tea, one with honey exactly the way she preferred it, a detail he'd apparently absorbed without her ever mentioning it directly. "I've spent my entire life around people like that. It's rarely about what they actually want. It's about refusing to accept that something isn't theirs to take." And what did she think she was entitled to? Vittorio considered the question for a moment before answering. "My attention, I suppose. Though I don't think she ever understood that my attention was never really hers to compete for in the first place, because it had already, quietly, over 4 years, settled somewhere she never bothered to notice." Delilah felt her face warm, the same way it had in the guest suite weeks earlier, and found herself smiling despite everything. "You're getting better at saying things like that directly instead of dancing around them." "I've had considerable motivation to improve," Vittorio said. Nearly losing someone tends to clarify a person's priorities rather quickly. 6 months later, the Castiglione household had settled into a rhythm considerably different from the one it had followed for the previous 4 years. Though to guests unfamiliar with the specific scandal that had reshaped it, the changes might have appeared subtle at first. Delilah no longer worked as household staff, not in the traditional sense, though the transition had taken considerably longer and involved considerably more of her own stubborn insistence than Vittorio would have preferred. She had refused, for months, to simply step into a role that felt, to her, uncomfortably close to being handed status rather than earning it, and it had taken long, patient conversations, and eventually a compromise neither of them had initially anticipated, before she'd agreed to take on a newly created position overseeing household operations and event coordination, a role that used every skill she'd spent 4 years quietly mastering, now compensated, recognized, and respected in ways it had never been before. The rest of the household staff, rather than resenting the change, had largely embraced it with a warmth that suggested they'd been quietly rooting for exactly this outcome for considerably longer than either Delilah or Vittorio had realized. The younger staff members she'd once made a point of protecting from late nights and difficult guests now found, in her new role, an advocate with real authority behind her. Someone who understood exactly what it meant to be overlooked and had no intention of allowing it to happen to anyone else under that roof. One evening, nearly a year after the anniversary gala that had upended both their lives, Vittorio found Delilah in the same east foyer where she'd fallen, standing at the base of the grand staircase, now fully repaired, properly lit, the decorative runner replaced entirely. "You're staring at the stairs again," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I do that sometimes," Delilah admitted. "Not because I'm afraid of them. More because I keep thinking about how close everything came to going very differently." "I think about that too." Vittorio's voice carried a quiet weight that had nothing to do with the careful, controlled authority he wore in every other room of the house. "More than I'd like to admit." Delilah looked at him, then back at the staircase, gleaming now beneath chandelier light that had never been allowed to dim again since that night. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't regret any of it. Even the part where I fell down an entire flight of stairs in front of 200 people. That's a remarkably generous perspective on a night that nearly got you seriously hurt. It's the night you finally stopped pretending you didn't notice me," Delilah said simply. "I'll take the staircase as the price of admission." Vittorio reached for her hand, the same careful, deliberate gesture he'd made in the guest suite months earlier. And this time, neither of them hesitated at all. "I have something for you," he said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket with the particular carefulness of a man who had been planning this moment for considerably longer than he was willing to admit. "I've been carrying it around for 2 weeks, trying to find the right moment." "You're terrible at hiding things in that jacket," Delilah said, echoing, without quite realizing it, words she would later learn had become something of a running joke between them, the way small phrases sometimes calcify into private language between two people who have decided, deliberately, to build a life together. "I've been told." He opened the small box, and inside, a modest, elegant ring caught the chandelier light in a way that made Delilah's breath catch entirely. "I carried you out of a ballroom a year ago because I couldn't stand the thought of anyone in this house hurting you and getting away with it. I'd like the chance, now, to carry you into considerably better rooms for the rest of my life, if you'll let me." Delilah looked at the ring, then at him, then at the staircase behind them, fully repaired, properly lit, no longer a place of danger but simply, now, the place where everything between them had finally, irrevocably changed. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. The wedding, when it happened 4 months later, was considerably smaller and considerably less glittering than the gala where they'd first publicly, dramatically, revealed what had been quietly growing between them for years. Vittorio had insisted on it, understanding, finally, exactly what mattered to the woman he was marrying, and what didn't. The household staff attended as guests rather than employees for the evening, seated at tables rather than serving them, a detail Delilah had specifically requested and Vittorio had readily granted. Somewhere near the back of the small gathering, Dario Conti stood watching the ceremony with the same methodical satisfaction he brought to every successfully completed investigation, having played, in his own quiet way, an essential role in ensuring this exact moment could happen at all. Cressida Van Hollen's name was never mentioned that evening, not once, her absence from the guest list, and from the city's wealthiest circles more broadly, so complete by that point that she had become, largely, a cautionary story told in whispers rather than a person anyone expected to encounter again. At the reception, Vittorio pulled Delilah aside during a quiet moment, away from the small crowd of well-wishers, and nodded toward the modest staircase leading up to the estate's private gallery, considerably less grand than the one where everything had begun, but familiar enough in its shape to carry a certain quiet significance. "No loosened rugs this time," he said. "I checked personally, twice." Delilah laughed, the sound warm and unguarded in a way it had rarely been during her 4 years working in that house, back when being noticed at all had felt like a risk rather than a gift. "I trust your inspection standards considerably more than most people's." "You should. I've had excellent motivation to become very thorough." He offered his arm, and together they climbed the staircase slowly, unhurried. No crowd watching this time, no crisis demanding urgency, only the quiet, ordinary certainty of two people who had found each other despite every obstacle placed deliberately in their path. At the top, Delilah paused, looking back down at the small gathering below, at the household staff who had once served her silently invisible existence and now celebrated openly beside her, at the life that had unfolded from a single, humiliating fall down a staircase that had, against every expectation, become the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything at all. "Someone once said I should be put out of my misery," she said quietly, remembering, without bitterness now, the words that had once cut so deeply. "Someone was very wrong," Vittorio said, drawing her close. "You were never the one in misery that night. You were simply the one everyone else in that room finally had to notice." Below them, the reception continued, warm and unglamorous and entirely theirs, built not on the performance of power that had once filled every Castiglione gala, but on something considerably more durable, the quiet, stubborn insistence of two people who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it meant to finally be seen.